This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with Gordon T. Long, and I have with me this morning Charles Hugh Smith. Charles is a well-recognized writer on the web. He's the publisher of the website Of Two Minds. Welcome back, Charles.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Glad to be here.
Charles, I want to jump right in because we've done a number of discussions on the pressures that we have on our Constitution, specifically the show we did recently on constitutional pressures, and I put it together into a series with some shows I did with John Rubino. And I really think that the materials you brought with you today ties a lot of it together front and center today with the discussion on the fiscal cliff, because it is leading on this roadmap to some fairly serious problems in the future. Can I ask you to take the lead right here with this first chart that we have?
The discussion about the fiscal cliff, Gordon, it seems to me that what's being missed is that the fiscal cliff is only the what you might call the tip of the iceberg of the financial problems that we're facing. That the country's political elite has overpromised on a vast scale what the government can pay to Social Security, to Medicare, Medicaid, National Defense. Everything's been overpromised. And so this appears on the surface to be only a financial debate. Oh, do we raise taxes? Do we cut costs? But actually, it's going to lead to a constitutional crisis because the political damage being done by the overpromising of benefits will eventually create a constitutional crisis. And the basis of that forecast is that the status quo in America is based on basically two moving parts. One is an entrenched political and financial elite buys the complicity of the bottom 50% of the people who are dependent on federal transfers. And this isn't just welfare. It includes retirees, people on disability, low-income households drawing an array of benefits. And so this creates what the founding fathers were afraid of, at least Madison was in the Federalist Papers, a tyranny of the majority. And what happens in a tyranny of the majority is that 50% plus who are drawing benefits and cash from the government will vote to raise taxes on the 20% who pay most of the taxes. And so we can say, this may be legal, but is it just or is it sustainable? And so, and that's really the basis of the constitutional crisis that lays ahead. And then what Jefferson warned us about that you mentioned in our previous show, which is what happens when the top 1% of the financial elite then buys the control over the government. And so that's really what we've seen too, is that the productive wealth of the country is now owned by a very small percentage of the population, and who can then use that income to buy influence in the government. And we see this through campaign donations. We see it through lobbying.
We see it through crony capitalism running totally out of control right now.
That's the key phrase. You get crony capitalism because the top 1/10 of 1% can then buy the government's control mechanisms so that they end up with cartels, monopolies, and crony capitalism.
It's only human nature that this is going to happen. And it's not for us to sit back and say, that's wrong, they shouldn't be doing that, and it's them. They're just doing what their job is to do, to accumulate wealth and money and grow profits. Flaw is ourselves not understanding what our forefathers taught us and told us that we had to stand on guard for. And we're not standing on guard.
Right. The Constitution has failed. And this is another one of those denial topics. Nobody wants to say that.
Charles, I would argue that we're failing the Constitution.
Well, that's it. Actually, that might be two sides of the same coin, that perhaps the Constitution allows us to control this kind of crony capitalism, and we've failed to do so.
Right, exactly. I say that in our previous show, we were talking about the importance of sound money, and we didn't stand on guard for that. And we've allowed this because once you're onto that roadmap, you as von Mises is very, very clear, you can't return from it, or nobody has successfully to date in 2,000 years.
What we also see in this slide of what the top 1% own is that the middle class owns very little productive wealth. They may own a house or, a mortgaged house, but they don't really control much of the productive wealth. And so then we get into the question of unearned income as opposed to earned income. And so the vast majority of people are wage earners, and they have earned income only, and it's taxed as earned income. The wealthy class owns the productive assets that generate rents, dividends, and so on, and that's unearned income, and that can be that's taxed at a lower rate, and it allows for a lot more loopholes and tax avoidance strategies. So this kind of income inequality has a lot of different causes, and we've spoken to those in the past. And it's not a simple, good guy, bad guy thing.
Basically, middle class is their wealth is tied up in their home, and that's not a producing asset. That's a consumption asset. And when you don't have a society that's producing more than it can consume, then suddenly even that asset becomes of less value. And so there's less money, if you would, to support higher house prices. So it becomes self-fulfilling, whereas the wealthy will always invest only in assets that produce money. And one of the things that's very troubling to me, Charles, right now is the rate at which capital investment, capex as they call it, is plummeting in the United States. In other words, those with money are not investing in productive assets that will employ people but will produce real wealth. We're in total freefall.
Yeah, let's look at the next slide, and it which shows nominal income. Like in just if you look at the dollars on your paycheck, they've gone up about 25% since the year 2000. But adjusted for inflation, what we call, real income, it's declined almost 10%. And, we've spoken about the effects of the internet and globalization, and there's a lot of causes for this. But you can see that the most important thing I think about this slide is the trend is long term. This is not a fluctuation from 2007 to 2009. This goes back. You can see that income has never been positive since the year 2000, except for these tiny little short-term blips. It's been going down for like 12 years.
Yeah, and the problem is this is probably adjusted on CPI, right, Charles?
Right. It could be a lot worse.
And it is a lot worse depending on your basket of goods. But if you factor in education and things like this that are real, and gasoline and food, it's much, much worse. And that spread is getting larger at a quicker rate. And that's why I would say in the last 3 years to 4 years, this compounding difference is hitting everybody like a sledgehammer.
And we can see that in this slide, where it's also another look at real median household income from 1979. And once again, the peak was 12 years ago, and for the working age households, it's over 10%.
I believe that we entered a secular bear market in December of 1999, and the stock market bubble effectively in April 2000 collapsed. And so even though in nominal terms we think that our society's been growing and recovering, if you adjusted anything, any kind of financial assets in real term, and household incomes, everything reflects the same kind of lack of real growth and lack of wealth creation, that we're in a long-term secular market. And so it shows up in the rate of retail sales, a rate of consumption. Everything is slowly but steadily in a downtrend. It's going from the top left-hand corner to the bottom right-hand corner.
I totally agree, and that the basis of everything, of taxes paid, of consumption, of investment, is household income. And if that falls 10%, you're not going to have higher retail values. You're not going to have higher investment. You're not going to have the higher investment that creates wealth. And we can see what this is to me, this chart of the full-time employment of the United States shows what really happened. Scrape away the nominal advances in stock market and so on. And what you have is we only have 115 million full-time jobs in the U.S. And that's the same level as we had about 12 years ago. And the rest of the jobs pay like less than $10,000. They're hardly even jobs, you know, in the sense of creating wealth or paying a lot of taxes to support the government. So, and we can see one of the key factors that a lot of people either avoid or in denial about or simply don't know is that most of the federal taxes are paid by a minority. And everyone talks about the top 1% and how well off they are. Well, they pay 37% of all the income taxes, and the top 10% earn 43% of the income and pay fully 70%. And so what we have is the top 25% of wage earners pay roughly 90% of all the taxes. So that means that the entire federal government and its $3.7 trillion in spending is supported by 25% of the people. And the other bottom 50% pay virtually nothing except Social Security taxes. So here we see a chart of federal spending, and I didn't draw an exponential curve, but I think it's fairly clear it has been on an exponential curve. Most of the federal money is spent on 4 programs: Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, the Pentagon and National Security, and interest on the national debt. And those 4 programs eat up all of the tax revenues, and then we need to borrow to cover them. The rest of the government is not even counted.
And that's what the politicians refer to as non-discretionary. Locked in, have to spend it.
Yeah, that's
Can't
right.
do anything about it, because when you starting comments, it's a huge social issue, and our values of what's important. And these numbers are, as you're well aware, and Charles, really understate the magnitude of the problem.
And so here we have a chart of the tax receipts, which topped out at $2.4 trillion. What this means is that the tax, that you see this heavy, steady rise of tax revenues has now topped out. And those of us, like Gordon and I, who look at technical analysis, we can see that this chart is topped out. It doesn't mean that taxes are going to suddenly leap up another $1 trillion. They've topped out, you know, and because incomes are declining and wealth is declining, they're not going to go up anymore. You can raise the tax rate. It doesn't mean that taxes are going to go up. So we have a structural gap of $1.3 trillion. Well, that's, you know, Gordon, most people may not know it, but that's like that's the whole GDP of entire nations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a huge number. And now we have 1.1 dependents on the government spending for every full-time worker. I don't think anybody can claim that is sustainable.
I've got projections, Charles, that show it rising dramatically of the dependence on the government, especially right off the bat. 75 million baby boomers about to retire.
Yeah.
And families themselves being smaller, and family formations actually shrinking, and people graduating from college being later because of student debt before they get married and even contemplate having a family. I was in conversations recently where the young lady was crying because she said I'll be in my 30s before I could possibly think of having children. And it really hit me how this new society facing huge problems. So think how that affects housing, think how that affects taxes. So this ratio, this 1.1, is going through the roof. And it's not just us. We're seeing dramatic in Japan and Europe also.
Yes, it is global. Absolutely. Well, the next slide, in this process, we realize, at least from my point of view, that our political and economic status quo was based on a grand political bargain. And that bargain was the top 1% controls, you know, the levers of the financial and political governance structure. And then the middle class will pay a lot of taxes, but will have the promise or the hope of improving their children's life and slowly building wealth, while the bottom half would get enough benefits from the government to survive. And so we now see the fiscal cliff is breaking up that grand political bargain. no one can, we cannot pay all that's been promised. We can't keep taxes low, for for everyone, and yet we also can't pay the benefits that have been promised. And so this is not going to be solved by whatever bargain is reached in the next month. This is structural. We're talking about 86 trillion and possibly more. That there's no way that money can be generated or collected in taxes. And so that will lead to a constitutional crisis.
When people like Chris Cox and Bill Archer publish in the Wall Street Journal and lay out the facts, and I personally believe they were very conservative in the numbers that they chose, but they bring it home. The arithmetic doesn't even come close. It's an order of magnitude issue. So the question is, well, what are we going to do about it? And I think it's like the Constitution. They require massive public debate and discussion, and that's not happening. And it isn't going to come out of a new Bowles-Simpson report that says here's what we should do, because everybody in society is going to be impacted by what's going to have to change here. Our whole concept of Social Security, medical coverage is going to have to be, I want it to be there for the elderly, but it's going to change because it's not possible we can pay it. We've made commitments that are totally and absolutely unsustainable. And we have a choice. Either we fix it or we're going to have nothing because the system will implode.
Yeah, Gordon, it just is astonishing what Cox and Archer came up with here, where it says the accrued expense of Medicare and Social Security every year is an additional $7 trillion. Well, that's twice what the government spends on everything.
It's very upsetting for some of us that have practiced a life of finance and accounting, and we understand how you do proper accounting. And the government, the federal government, the way it is structured, its books, the actuarial logic to it is ill-funded, it's political, and so we've distorted ourselves. We've allowed ourselves to hide the truth. Good accounting does is it forces you to look at the truth. So because it's hidden from us, it's still there, it's allowed us to reach a point now where it's almost insurmountable of what we can do about this problem. I'm not holding up that we don't have any hope, but it starts with at least recognizing the problem. And I was very encouraged that the Wall Street Journal actually published it.
Yeah, if we move to the next slide, I think there's another quote here that says to collect enough tax revenue to avoid deeper into debt would require $8 trillion in tax collections annually. Well, as the previous slide showed, we only collect 2.4 trillion, and looks like it's topped out. So to say we're going to have to collect 4 times as much tax to sustain the system, obviously that's impossible. I mean, if we took all of the money earned by the top 25% of households and all of the corporate taxes, that would only bring in 6.7 trillion, less than the 8 trillion needed just to keep the system afloat. That's phenomenal.
The only word that comes to my mind is delusional and denial.
Yes.
I think that historians are going to be very, very unkind to our country, that we as a society and this generation practiced denial to the level that we did, and as long as we did it, that we've reached this stage. And, we went back and revisited Social Security, Medicare, because we knew it was unbreakable or was unfundable back in the Reagan era. And I believe it was 87, if I recall, to put it back on firm founding. And we thought we did. We did it again, in the 90s, and we're about to try and do it again, except that what we did with those putting back on firm founding is we increased the rates, but it was nowhere near the commitments that we've made. So we really just created a fiction. And now the reality is here. And, in accounting, Charles, when you're running a business and if you hide it from yourself, when it comes time and it hits, you can't do anything about it. You've lost all the runway. It's like taking off an airplane. There's no more runway. And we've reached that stage clearly that Cox and Archer are spelling out. They didn't come up with a solution to this either in their article, I might add.
Yeah, because you and I have discussed the only avenue open to the state when you get to the final financial repression, which is they can print the $86 trillion and distribute it. But of course, that destroys your entire economy and your money.
And that's the part of the point that you're making earlier when you've got the the rentier class, the wealthy, who in fact are the ones that pay the majority of the taxes in this grand bargain, but it's predicated on the fact that they plow the investment back in to allow the middle class to have a standard of living. Well, that's stopped, and what's changed dramatically is that money's now being invested outside the country. When you had borders around it, this grand bargain kind of worked. But what's happened is we tore down these boundaries, and so suddenly you're now investing outside the country where you can get cheaper labor. You can get a different social contract. And that's happened in such a way, in such a speed, as 46,000 manufacturing companies have left this country in the last 13 years. That's a massive problem, but it says that this grand bargain has changed, and we're not investing in our future. We're just not.
That's an excellent point, Gordon. That really is a point that is not understood or stated often enough. And we've created a lot of incentives for people to go offshore, just as we've created incentives for people to devote so much of their resources to tax evasion, because that's what happens when you raise taxes to really high rates, like 35% of corporations. Then the corporations have to spend a huge amount of time and money finding some way to dodge that bullet.
Money goes where it's treated well, and it goes very quickly. And when you don't treat your money well, it flees. And that's what's been going on in the United States for about 10 years right now. And especially when we threaten higher taxes and more penalties. And when people do the accounting and smart money look at the accounting and said, this country is fundamentally insolvent, and I know that they're going to come after me. What are you going to do? Sit and wait? And so you start to invest in other places in other ways. And so it's not that we should expect that. And you can't put up barriers to it, because it will always go that way. It's a part of this globalization that's happened, and we have never come to grips with what globalization truly meant, and as sovereign boundaries disappeared, as the internet does it, as we have global trade happening and global investment. We all want it, but we don't understand the magnitude of it. Charles, once again, we're up against our hard line, and we're out of time. We have to wrap here. Any closing comments that you want to make?
No, I just want to say that I look forward to our discussions on solutions and options for our listeners, which we'll be addressing in 2013.
I'm looking forward to it too, Charles, because we've been kind of negative on the issues, and there are solutions. They're painful solutions. But there's also a lot of it's not just recognizing where we went wrong, but recognizing what the future is going to be about. And you and I have had these discussions on the nature of work is changing. The nature of our perceptions of occupations and jobs are in the midst of a massive transformation. The internet is revolutionizing how processes and work is done. And the bad news is obsoleting massive swarms of people and jobs. And where are they going to be replaced? And they're going to be replaced. We will. I have the tremendous respect and belief in the human condition for improvement. And our society will recover and do very, very well. It will be painful, but it's going to be a new type of work, at least a new perception on how you employ yourself and what your future looks like for you. The days of middle-class job at a factory and retirement are gone. They're history. I'm looking forward to the new year with you, Charles, and I'm looking forward to our next session. We're going to pick up. I'm hoping that, again, to have a session and talk about your new books. Could you give our listeners some information and how they can learn more about your writings and your website and the things you work on?
Please visit me at of2minds.com. Thank you.
Talk to you later, Charles.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Great. Bye.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.